This week's lecture, we're going to take a look at Camera and Computer Arts, Chapter 9 in the textbook. Now, when we consider how long human beings have been actually making art, the camera and the computer are very recent developments. Yet both of these things, the camera and the computer, have fundamentally changed how we view and how we experience art. The camera is based on a natural phenomenon that has actually been known since ancient times. And that is that light reflected from an object under controlled circumstances can project an image of that object onto a surface. Now, however, it was not until the 19th century that a way was found to capture and preserve such a projected image, and this led to film and to video. The computer also is rooted in discoveries from the past, if we define a computer as simply a machine to process data. In the early 20th century, the first computers were so big that they filled an entire room. And now we can hold so much more, thousands of times more data in a machine that fits in the palm of our hand. And I always wonder, where is it going? How much more, where will these technologies continue to go as we've made so many strides in them over the past century? Now, both the camera and the computer have become really valuable tools for artists and have changed the course of art in their own way. Now, we're going to look at a lot of more modern developments in camera and computer art, but let's go back to the very, very beginning, shall we? Which would be the camera obscura. Now, this is an interesting object, and what it is that let's talk about where the camera obscura started. It dates back to an ancient Chinese philosopher who in 5th century BC discovered that when light comes through a pinhole into a darkened room, it will reflect the image outside of the room upside down onto a wall. Now look here at this image. It's a pretty good projection of a gigantic camera obscura. This was actually used quite a bit by the artists in the 17th century. In particular, the artist Johannes Vermeer, Vermeer, used the camera obscura to lay out his paintings. And when you look at his work, it's very clear to see the photographic quality in them. So we start with the guy in ancient China who figures this out, and then an Arab mathematician set up an experiment using candles with the box. And they worked with something that was eventually called the camera obscura. So this image, as projected, is blurry and it's upside down, but it's an image all the same, and it's rather exciting when you think about it. Now, what happened was that this concept was kept alive. As I said, many artists used it in the 1600s to help lay out their artwork. But then in the 16th century, people started developing lenses, as in the development of the telescope and the microscope and, of course, the camera obscura. So then the one problem that remained as the image got clearer with the use of images was, how do you make the image stay on the projected surface? So again, looking at this image, you can see that it's projected upside down for this guy who's probably an artist. But how can he retain that image unless he paints it? So then we come up to the development of modern photography, and which is based on the camera obscura. The first photograph was created by a man whose name is pretty much lost to history. His name was Joseph Niepce. And he created a fuzzy image by projecting it onto a pewter plate inside of his camera obscura. And this was way back in 1827. Now, he died soon after, and his son took over the investigations that he had started. Now, Niepce had been secretly corresponding with another Frenchman, and his name was Louis Daguerre. These two men worked separately, and they communicated in code because they wanted to keep their discoveries secret so that they could benefit from them. But it was actually Daguerre who made the breakthrough image. He projected his image onto a copper plate that was coated with a silver iodide, and he named his invention the daguerreotype. So if you wanted to know what was the name of the very first kind of projected image, daguerreotype. Within a few years after the release of his invention, other people had jumped in and innovated the process, so it was pretty sophisticated actually. Um, let's look at one of Daguerre's early photographs. Now this was done in, I believe it's 1837, and what's fun about this image is that it's actually a busy Paris street, but it looks totally deserted, except for one person who was perhaps standing still, and you can see them sort of in the left foreground. So as the people were moving on this street, they were not caught in the exposure. Only those things which stayed still through the exposure were held here. But this is considered the first modern photograph. As early photographers explored the medium, they didn't really have any guidelines as to where to go with it, and they went in a lot of different directions. One early photographer who did some really quite striking work was the artist Julia Cameron. Now, Julia Cameron, she was a friend of the luminaries of the day, people whose names we still know. Like she was a friend of Charles Darwin. She knew Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and Alfred Tennyson. So she was friends with this high sort of elite group of intellectuals, and she took pictures of a lot of them. That's how we do have pictures of Charles Darwin and of Longfellow. But some of her very best portraits were of her niece and other people that she knew in her life. And these are deeply moving portraits, and I think what's so striking about them is their humanity. Like, even though this is done in probably the 1850s, we can see the human being there. We can see her struggles. We can see her life. And that was one way that early photography was used. Now, this early photography in this example that we see here, it needed a lot of bulky equipment in order to work. You had this gigantic camera, these heavy plates. It had to sit on a stand. So in order to shoot a photograph, it also needed a very long exposure. So there was quite an ordeal, quite a to-do to set up a photograph. Now, in 1888, there was a guy named George Eastman who invented the Kodak camera. And this camera innovated photography because it was a handheld camera and it was lightweight and it could be taken anywhere. Now, this opened up photography to the populace, to humanity. So it became quite popular for people to have hobbies as photographers. And it also opened up all sorts of subject matter to be photographed. This particular piece is done by the artist Richard Throssell. And he was actually a Native American himself, and he was adopted into the Crow tribe. He was born a Cree and adopted into the Crow tribe. So he was granted this access that really the photographers like Edward Curtis and other photographers that were not of the tribe, they didn't get the same kind of access as Richard Throssell did. I find this image to be really interesting. Notice the dog over on the right. See, they had pets even then. So another way that this development of the camera really took shape was in the development of what we call photojournalism. And you could think of it as the photographer being given a mission to bear witness to acts, to record important events in history, and perhaps to raise awareness about them. One of the films in this week's lesson is about the photographer Lewis Hines, and he himself pretty much single-handedly, by taking these very, very painful images of children working in factories, he was very instrumental in getting child labor laws through Congress because he took these images, he shared them, people were outraged, and thus, 3-year-olds were no longer working in cotton mills, for example. Another important photographer who did this kind of work was she's among my favorite. Well, this whole school of photojournalism from the 1930s. This is the photographer Dorothea Lange, and she was a very important photographer of the time. She traveled throughout the country taking pictures of those that were hardest hit by the Great Depression. Now, photojournalists are interested in more than a single snapshot. They don't want to just record a scene. They want to capture an event, a place, or a culture, or a cultural happening through a series of images that give the feeling of that place. And this was done on a really a wide scale during the Great Depression. And you know, the Great Depression, as you probably do know, started in 1929 with the stock market crash. And it went on until the beginning of World War II in 1941. We got involved in 41. And in order to ease this problem of wide-scale unemployment, the Farm Security Administration set up programs to help artists and photographers. Now, these programs also helped people from other walks of life, but we're just really interested in the photographers at this point. I'm going to give you a little side note, though. There are murals in post offices all over the country that were done by artists who were commissioned by the Farm Security Administration and thus able to continue making art and feed their families. Now, Dorothea Lange did much the same thing that Lewis Hines did, in that he raised awareness of the suffering of these people that were really kind of invisible to society. Now, I love this image, and I'm going to point to a little girl here. This girl is featured in several of her Dorothea Lange's famous photographs. She actually looks malnourished, and she looks like she's really had a very, very difficult life. And I think that's part of what really raised the consciousness. The picture in your textbook is one of the most famous pictures by Dorothea Lange. Here's another image, and I include it because this group of people was even more invisible than the migrant workers from, say, the Dust Bowl in Oklahoma and North Texas. These are African Americans, probably living in the deep rural South, and she was able to record and share with the public, with the wider public, how they were actually living, and maybe raise a little compassion and a little awareness. And here's one more. You can tell I like this photographer because I have 3 of them. But I find this photograph to be deeply moving because, you know, you can see the despair in the woman and you can't help but notice how thin she is. You know, she's the one who has probably been skipping the food in order to feed her family. Now, I do want to talk about another important photojournalist, but one that we might not be so familiar with, and that's because he's from East India. And this is the guy named Raghupur Singh. And he was traveling in his country with an American photographer. They were both shooting pictures. And then he noticed that the American photographer was really drawn to the slums, the most disturbing, pathetic aspects of East Indian culture. And this guy thought, Raghupur Singh, he thought, well, wait a minute. My society is not like that. And so what he has done is he's photographed the poorer people in India, but he's done that in a way that shows the joy and the quality of their life, rather than just focusing on the despair. And if you look at the image in your textbook by Raghupur Singh, you can really see of this exemplified, in that it's a family that literally lives on the street, but they're going through the same thing that any family would go through on a daily basis. So this is very important work. So far we were talking about just the origins of photography and how it's been used to create social and cultural change. Now let's go back a little bit towards the beginning and talk about photography as an art form. You know, photography actually radicalized painting because painting had been used to record scenes, to create portraits, and once photography sort of took over that role in a way, in that photography allowed artists to capture a scene realistically, that were capturing the actual scene, then painting didn't have to just reproduce a scene. A painting could do so many things besides that, and this really gave birth to modern art. Oh, but I'm going off on a tangent. Let's look again at the early art photography. So when photography first came out, artists really didn't know how to respond. They didn't know what to do with it. And this is an artist named Henry Peach Robinson, and he's also featured in your textbook. And he would set up these vignettes, these little story scenes, like a play, and then he would take pictures of them. The one in your book is very famous, and it's the dying girl, and it all looks so sad, except for it's all so fake. But that was how he was choosing to use photography, almost like theater. It's interesting to look up his work online and to see all the different scenes that he set up to make sort of a moral point or whatever. This is the trespassers, and apparently they've come home and found a no trespassing sign on their door. Okay, this completes part 1 of the presentation. Stay tuned for part 2.